Flood emergencies unfolding in 3 states. Thousands evacuated as waters continue to rise. Trapped residents rescued as homes are inundated in Melbourne. Russia urges residents to evacuate from the occupied region of Kherson as Ukrainian forces continue their advance. Former US President Donald Trump ordered to give evidence by the committee investigating the January 6 Capitol riots. So, will he oblige, and what happens if he refuses? And mandatory isolation no longer required, the end of one of the last remaining COVID-19 restrictions, but not everyone has welcomed the change.
This is SBS World News with Ricardo Gonçalves.
Good evening. There are flood alerts across 3 states tonight, with evacuation orders in New South Wales and Victoria, and concerns remain for communities in Tasmania. Record levels of flooding have been recorded as heavy rain continues to lash the east coast. In Victoria, widespread flooding continues along large parts of the state. We have reporters standing by tonight in affected areas in Melbourne, regional Victoria and Tasmania. But we begin tonight in Melbourne, where flooding caused residents to evacuate after the Maribyrnong River broke its banks, impacting at least 100 properties.
Flooding in suburban Melbourne as the streets of Maribyrnong are inundated. An evacuation order issued this morning as the banks of the Maribyrnong River in Melbourne's inner northwest broke its banks. At least 245 houses flood affected. Sam Talib says he watched helplessly as floodwaters spilled into his home.
It's like just watching there in terror, you know. It's very painful, but you know, at least I had to quickly grab my partner out.
By midday, around 90 people had checked into the relief centre, returning to their homes as floodwaters stabilised to assess the damage.
Obviously hard for the kids to see their beds floating, and it'll be hard on my wife and that type of thing. But look, you know, we're okay.
The SES conducting 60 rescues. This level of flooding not seen in 30 years.
What they didn't realise was that the flood was going to be so quick and so high, and they've then called us to say, please get us out.
Thousands of homes remain without power, residents in shock at how quickly it happened.
This was still road this morning, so it just keeps coming, it's not stopping.
Federal member for Maribyrnong Bill Shorten describing the situation as devastating.
There has been historically the occasional flood in the Maribyrnong area. The last really big one was 1974. Since then, nothing like this has been seen.
In regional Victoria, in the town of Rochester, house after house, property after property swallowed up by water as far as the eye can see. The town remains under evacuation orders, but many have stayed behind, including pub owners Craig and Teresa Mann.
The back half of the hotel's 2 foot high, the front half, so we'll stay up there.
The town of Seymour, 100 kilometres north of Melbourne, recorded its highest flood levels since 1974. Hundreds of homes and businesses inundated as the Goulburn River swelled, peaking at nearly 8.5 metres. The Premier says more than 1,500 people who have been displaced by flooding have already accessed one-off support payments. He's also spoken with the Prime Minister about any additional support that may be required, with the flooding situation expected to last days and possibly weeks.
In some communities, not necessarily everywhere that's flooded now, but in some communities, even a minor rainfall event in a week or two may well mean that some people are impacted, that flood is back on in that local community.
The federal government stands ready to provide support and assistance. There are already ADF personnel on the ground in Victoria providing that support and assistance.
And while the water may have receded in some places for now, the threat across many parts of the state is far from over.
And Abby Dinham is in Maribyrnong in Melbourne tonight. Abby, how are water levels there looking now?
Good evening, Ricardo. The water levels have gone down significantly just in the last few hours, but as you can see behind me, many homes still remain inaccessible. There's about a dozen streets still under evacuation orders here in Maribyrnong. The SES says the Maribyrnong River peaked at about midday at about 4 metres, but people along these riverside properties have told us that in their own homes, water levels got up to about a metre. There's been at least a dozen requests for emergency accommodation through the Maribyrnong Relief Centre. The Premier, Daniel Andrews, confirming this afternoon that his request to the federal government to re-establish the Mickleham COVID quarantine facility for those who've had flood-damaged homes has been approved. The Commonwealth said it will reopen next week and will be able to house about 250 people for 6 to 8 weeks.
OK, Abby Dinham there in Maribyrnong, thank you for that update. Let's now move across to Sean Wales. He is in Shepparton in northern Victoria, which is bracing for flooding. Sean, what's the feeling there at the moment? OK, I'm not sure if we've got Sean there, but Sean, if you can hear me, Sean's in Shepparton in northern Victoria. Sean, what's the feeling there at the moment?
Yeah, good evening, Ricardo. Well, there's a lot of nervous people here in Shepparton tonight, and this is why. The Goulburn River, which runs through the town, has started to break its banks at some points, currently sitting at around 10 metres. It's expected to start flooding from tomorrow morning until at least Tuesday. Authorities warning up to 4,000 properties could be affected. I spoke to some residents earlier today whose properties are right on the banks of the river, and they were just watching as it slowly rose and rose towards their backyards. They were frantically sandbagging their properties, but admit if it reaches the expected 12-metre height, it will matter very little. The Premier, Daniel Andrews, has arrived in Shepparton this afternoon ahead of this major flood, and the Australian Defence Force is also on hand to assist. Ricardo, sadly, it's inevitable many homes and livelihoods will be affected tomorrow, with residents currently stockpiling supplies and preparing for a tough few days ahead.
OK, Sean Wales there reporting from Shepparton in northern Victoria, which is bracing for flooding. Thank you. Let's now get an update from our Tasmania correspondent, Sarah Maunda. She joins us tonight from outside Deloraine. Sarah, what's happening where you are?
Good evening, Ricardo. Well, there are still major flood warnings for the north-south-esk rivers and the Meander River tonight in Tasmania. And many parts of north and northwest Tasmania have received record-breaking rainfalls in the last 24 to 48 hours. Now, emergency services so far have praised Tasmanians for their preparedness for this event. So far, 2 groups of people have had to be rescued. A couple just before 6:30 this morning were rescued from their four-wheel drive when they attempted to drive through floodwaters just at Deloraine behind me here. They were rescued, but they were unable to be rescued by the helicopter, which couldn't get to them because of power lines, and they were stuck on their car for a short time. However, emergency services were able to get them to safety. Now, the floodwaters here in Tasmania are receding and the rain has passed. However, authorities here warn that because there's so much water in the landscape, there could be flooding into the weekend. Here's what authorities had to say earlier.
Although the rain stopped, this is a dangerous period for Tasmanians. It's evident to people that the event's passed. However, the ramifications of this event we will live for an extended period of time.
Now, so far, the towns are most affected by these floodwaters are Deloraine just behind me and Latrobe. Now, Deloraine here, authorities are using aerial surveillance to get an idea of exactly how many homes have been affected, and we should know more in the coming hours and days. Ricardo?
That is our Tasmania correspondent, Sarah Maunda, updating us from outside of Deloraine. And more than 60 flood warnings remain in place across New South Wales, including multiple emergency warnings around Wagga Wagga and Forbes. Evacuation orders have been issued for around 250 properties in Forbes. The Lachlan River has reached its major flood level and is expected to peak around 10.6 metres this evening. Emergency services are warning other flood-affected communities such as Warren and Weewaw may be isolated for some time. Russia says its forces will help evacuate residents of the occupied Kherson region. The latest sign the Ukrainian counter-offensive is having success. State television is reporting they'll be arriving in Rostov sometime tonight. The Ukrainian government says its troops have retaken more than 600 settlements in the past month, including 75 in the Kherson region.
The Ukrainian fight back on the southern front line is gaining traction. This village in the Kherson region was recently liberated to the relief of locals.
На нашу вулицю немає ні єдиного дому, щоб не пострадав. Все тут. Кошмар був. Та ні одного дня не було спокійного.
The Moscow-installed governor is now urging residents in occupied areas to evacuate to Russia.
Обращаясь к руководству страны, хочу попросить у вас помощи в организации такой работы.
The Kremlin has agreed to help with the operation, another sign Russian forces are struggling in the region. There are increasing nerves inside Russia too. An apartment building hit in Belgorod, not far from the border. Local authorities blaming Ukrainian shelling. Ukrainian officials suggesting it was a stray Russian missile. That's possible given the sheer number which are being launched into Ukraine. This is the result of another early morning flurry into Mykolaiv. A 12-year-old boy pulled from the rubble after 6 hours is expected to recover from his injuries. It's not just missiles Ukrainians are having to shelter from, with Iranian-made kamikaze drones striking critical infrastructure in the Kyiv region. NATO will soon deliver counter-drone equipment to deal with that threat. Defence ministers wrapping their Brussels summit with a discussion over how the alliance would respond to a Russian nuclear strike in Ukraine.
Circumstances in which NATO might have to use nuclear weapons are extremely remote. We will not go into exactly how we will respond, but of course this will fundamentally change the nature of the conflict. It will mean that a very important line has been crossed.
While the world awaits Vladimir Putin's next move, he was the one being kept waiting by Turkey's president. Tayyip Erdogan sees himself as a potential peacemaker, but both sides denied discussing a deal to end the war. Instead, the Russian leader was pitching power.
Смотреть возможность строительства еще одной газопроводной системы и создания на территории Турции газового хаба для продаж в другие страны, в третьи страны, прежде всего, конечно, в европейские, если они в этом, разумеется, заинтересованы.
The days of Europe relying on Russian energy are likely over. In her first public comments on the topic, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she has no regrets over the gas deals she made with Moscow.
Aus der damaligen Perspektive war es sehr rational und nachvollziehbar, leitungsgebundenes Gas. Und selbst im Kalten Krieg war Russland ein verlässlicher Energielieferant.
How much the world has changed in just 8 months. Ben Lewis, SBS World News.
Former US President Donald Trump will be subpoenaed to testify before the House committee investigating the January 6 attack on the US Capitol. Describing Mr Trump as the central player in the insurrection, the committee voted unanimously for him to be compelled to give evidence and to be held accountable for his actions. If he doesn't, he could face criminal charges and imprisonment.
The 9th public hearing dropped new bombshells. Never before seen footage of elected members being rushed to safety as the US Capitol came under attack from supporters of Donald Trump. Nancy Pelosi and others locked down.
They're putting on their tear gas masks.
House members filmed as they fled, senators begging for help.
We have some senators who are still in their hideaways. They need massive personnel now. Can you get the Maryland National Guard to come too?
It was just horrendous, and all at the instigation of the President of the United States.
Having conducted 1,000 interviews, the committee made the case that the riots were part of Donald Trump's plan to overturn his 2020 election loss.
Donald Trump knew he lost.
He's going to declare victory, but that doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner.
Trump was, the committee said, the central player in the January 6 attacks.
We are obligated to seek answers directly from the man who set this all in motion. And every American is entitled to those answers.
The hearing's final twist, a vote to subpoena the former president.
Those in favour will say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed is no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mocking the subpoena on his Truth Social platform, Trump posted, "Why didn't the Unselect Committee ask me to testify months ago? Why did they wait until the very end, the final moments of their last meeting?"
It is almost certain that Donald Trump will not testify. Already his spokesman has been dismissing this move as a partisan exercise.
The subpoena will be served within days. If Trump defies it, he could face a 12-month jail sentence. But if the Republicans take control of the House in next month's midterm elections, it's likely the subpoena could be ripped up, the investigation over, with no compulsion for Donald Trump to answer for his actions. Felicity Davey, SBS World News.
Coming up, the cost of living pain is not just being felt here. A new warning for world leaders to stay on top of spiralling inflation before it hurts the most vulnerable. Also tonight, families left devastated after a gunman who killed 17 people at a school in Florida is sentenced. And courtroom confrontation, Brittany Higgins directly addresses the man she has accused of raping her. The head of the International Monetary Fund has urged policymakers to keep up the fight against inflation, even if it means more hardship in the immediate future. Kristalina Georgieva said the world was facing a period of extraordinary economic turmoil, but curbing rising prices should be a priority. New US data released overnight shows consumer prices edged 8.2% higher over the year.
It's 3 years since the world's finance chiefs have been able to come together for the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank. In that time, crisis has followed crisis.
An unrelenting pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, climate disasters on all continents, and now a cost of living crisis.
The head of the IMF said there'd been a fundamental shift from relative predictability and stability to uncertainty and volatility, a much more complex time that requires steady hands on the policy levers. And she singled out inflation as the biggest threat.
We cannot possibly allow inflation to become a runaway train. Bad for growth and bad for people. Bad especially for poor people.
Spain's finance minister said the war in Ukraine had triggered energy and food crises that required a global response.
I think it's a wake-up call to all of us that when we're confronted with global challenges such as these, we need to respond with our global multilateral institutions.
A senior policymaker said the IMF and World Bank were well placed to help.
These are institutions with shareholders. They respond to their shareholders. Who are the shareholders? The global community. Of course, we will respond to their demands. We will adjust our work programs accordingly, and we will do our best to respond to these multiple crises.
As well as the global focus, there was a lot of attention on one country in particular, the United Kingdom. Its plans for unfunded tax cuts and increased spending have triggered turmoil on the financial markets. And the IMF chief said she'd raise the need for coherent policies with the British Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng.
When monetary policy puts a foot on the brakes, fiscal policy should not step on the accelerator, because if it does, we are for a very dangerous right.
Soon after she spoke, Mr Kwarteng announced he was cutting short his visit to Washington and returning to London. It coincided with reports that Prime Minister Liz Truss is considering more U-turns amid mounting discontent within her party, including talk of removing her from the job she's held for little more than a month. Nick Wells, SBS World News.
And global markets have surged despite the latest inflation report from the US showing the rise in consumer prices remain problematic. We'll find out why later in On the Money. The federal government is warning the international economic conditions will change the forecasts in this month's budget. While the release of the budget document is just 11 days away, the Treasurer says the final cuts are yet to be finalised.
I got it. He didn't have faith.
In the hunt for budget wealth, relishing the gold rush at this Sydney refinery.
That's $1 million each one. Oof, each one. $1 million? Yes.
You had to take it back.
The Prime Minister looking for windfalls with high hopes for the Australian economy.
We can be a renewable energy superpower.
But his Treasurer dispatched to Washington to find out just how much conditions outside Australia will add to budget strain.
We are treading a narrower, more perilous path when it comes to the global economy. The best defence against global economic uncertainty is responsible budgets.
Perils spelled out by the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Chair of the US Federal Reserve Jerome Powell, and UK Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng.
The number one enemy when it comes to the global economy is inflation. In some areas where we are trimming spending or reprofiling spending, it will be seen as a series of difficult decisions taken in difficult times.
So far, international indicators suggest that growth will contract in Australia, but the nation will avoid the woes some other countries are bracing for.
If we're driven into a recession by bad Labor decisions, it'll be families, it'll be pensioners, it'll be people on fixed incomes, and it will be many small businesses across the country that ultimately pay the price for that failure.
In Australia, inflation is still set to peak before Christmas, but the price of electricity is expected to be an ongoing pinch point. The Treasurer now warning that inflation forecasts for next year will be updated in the budget.
There is some prospect that upward pressure on electricity prices will change the profile of inflation after that, and I'll make that clear on budget night.
A summer of power price pain to come. Anna Henderson, SBS World News.
The gunman in one of the deadliest school shootings in the United States history has been spared the death penalty to the dismay of families and of some of the victims. Nicholas Cruz pleaded guilty to murdering 17 people. He faces life in prison without the possibility of parole after the jury was unable to unanimously agree he be executed.
The culmination of a harrowing 3-month-long multiple murder trial. Gunman Nicholas Cruz to learn if he's to be executed.
As to count 1, we the jury find as follows as to Nicholas Cruz in this case.
The 24-year-old showed little emotion during the 50 minutes it took the judge to read all 17 of the jury's recommended sentences. The jury spared him the death penalty, instead sending him to prison for the rest of his life. Many families of the victims angry, baffled and in tears.
I believe justice was not done. The wrong verdict was given out today.
If not now the death penalty, then when? When?
Cruz pleaded guilty to 17 murders and 17 counts of attempted murder last year. On Valentine's Day 2018, the then 19-year-old used a semi-automatic rifle to kill 14 students and 3 members of staff at his former school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High, in the city of Parkland. The trial in Florida included graphic videos of him hunting for victims. The prosecution had requested the death penalty, arguing that Cruz's crime was premeditated, heinous and cruel. The jury, though, unable to unanimously agree that he should be executed, finding that mitigating factors, including an alleged brain disorder, outweighed aggravating factors.
I just don't think anything else is appropriate except the capital sentence in this case.
Under Florida law, a jury must be unanimous in sentencing a defendant to be executed.
If this was not the most perfect death penalty case,
then why do we have the death penalty at all?
You set a precedent for the next mass killing, and nothing happens to you. You'll get life in jail. I'm sorry. That is not okay.
Cruz's defence imploring the local community to respect the jury's verdict.
This is the system that we all cherish, that we all abide by, and supported by our Constitution.
Victims' families, along with those wounded, will be able to address Cruz directly when he's formally sentenced next month. Philippa Carisbrook, SBS World News.
And still in the US, a gunman opened fire along a walking trail in North Carolina's capital, Raleigh, killing 5 people and prompting a manhunt that shut down the city. An off-duty police officer was among those killed. 2 other people, including another officer, were wounded and taken to hospital. Police swarmed the scene, warning residents to shelter. They eventually contained the suspect, described only as a juvenile white male. He has been taken into custody. From today, Australians who test positive to COVID-19 are no longer required to isolate for 5 days. Mandatory isolation was one of the last remaining pandemic restrictions. The decision has been called reasonable by some, but for others it is too soon, as infection rates remain steady across the country. This week, New South Wales reported almost 12,000 cases. There were more than 8,000 in Victoria and just over 7,000 in Queensland. Nationally, 194 people died with COVID.
Lockdowns are already a distant memory, and now one of the last bastions of emergency pandemic measures has fallen. Australians no longer mandated by law to isolate for 5 days if they test positive to COVID-19, with exceptions for those who work in high-risk settings. The end of mandatory isolation welcomed by several business and industry groups.
Retailers are really pleased with this development. Staff shortages are absolutely acute in retail at crisis point, particularly in the build up to Christmas. So every day, every worker makes a difference, particularly for small business.
The decision made by National Cabinet 2 weeks ago has not been without criticism. The Australian Medical Association urging caution.
Removing all of the protections like mandatory isolation at a time when immunity from COVID is waning rapidly in the community, when there are big problems with the booster program, and we know there's a lot of travel and a huge wave of COVID building in the Northern Hemisphere, we're very concerned about the risk of another wave in Australia.
Today, New South Wales joined Victoria in no longer requiring people to report a positive rapid antigen test.
It means that case numbers, formal case numbers in both those states are going to go down. So even though more and more people are getting infected, we simply won't see it anymore. It's the idea is that if you don't test, then you won't find any cases, therefore COVID's gone. You can see the fallacy in that.
Experts still recommend people with symptoms stay at home until they've recovered. But for some, that's not possible, now that the federal government's pandemic payments have also been scrapped.
My heartfelt plea to anyone who is not feeling well but has to go to work is please wear a good quality face mask and wear it properly over your nose, because I see so many people wearing it under their nose, which does no good at all.
With Australia turning a page on mandatory isolation, health experts say this could result in more cases of long COVID, about which very little is known. Rochelle Harrison-Pless, SBS World News.
1 in 8 Australians, including 1 in 6 children, are living in poverty. That is the finding of the latest Poverty in Australia snapshot released by the Australian Council of Social Service in collaboration with the University of New South Wales. The report examined the most recent ABS data on household income from 2019 to 2020. It found that the poverty rate was 14.6% in the March quarter of 2020 at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. Then, in the June quarter, temporary income support payments saw it fall to a 17-year low of 12%.
So those drops we saw in poverty in the second quarter of 2020 were a direct result of the Commonwealth Government income support payments. So this natural experiment over COVID has shown that we are able to significantly reduce poverty in Australia.
The report authors say while there is no population data to determine current poverty rates, surveys have shown the withdrawal of COVID payments, in addition to the rising cost of living, are having an impact. Brittany Higgins today directly addressed the man she accused of raping her in Parliament House, Bruce Lerriman, shouting across the courtroom at him. Mr Lerriman has pleaded not guilty to the alleged sexual assault. His account of what happened on the night in question has also been made public for the first time. And a warning, this story contains some graphic details.
Brittany Higgins free of the witness stand after a total of 5 days of testimony. She had been unavailable this week, but today completed cross-examination, the defence asking, "Mr Lerriman did not sexually assault you." Ms Higgins, in tears, replied, "No, he was physically violating me. He was in my body." At one stage, Ms Higgins turned to face the accused and shouted, "Nothing was fine after what you did to me." Bruce Lerriman has pleaded not guilty. His barrister put to Ms Higgins she fabricated the allegation to avoid losing her job. Ms Higgins told the court, "I'm not a monster. You're asserting to me that I've completely fabricated this just to keep my job. Yes, ma'am. I cared about my job, but I would never do that." The court has previously heard Brittany Higgins and Bruce Lerriman's presence in Parliament House on the night of March 22, 2019 was considered a security breach by their then boss Fiona Brown. At the time, she was the Chief of Staff to Senator Linda Reynolds. Earlier this week, the trial continued in Ms Higgins' absence under a now-lifted suppression order. On Tuesday, the court was shown letters Ms Brown drafted on behalf of Senator Reynolds. Bruce Lerriman's contract was due to expire, but the letters reveal because of serious misconduct, his employment was terminated. Among that misconduct, Fiona Brown testified, was entry to Parliament under false pretences. The court heard audio of Mr Lerriman telling security he was picking up documents. Ms Brown said there was no urgent work purpose, and Mr Lerriman told her he came back to the office to drink whiskey. The 3 different reasons Bruce Lerriman gave for his presence in Parliament House on the night of the alleged rape are central to the prosecution's case. He told Ms Brown he was there to drink whiskey, he told security he needed to pick up documents, and in a 3-hour police interview played to the court, he told officers he needed to pick up his apartment keys. In that interview, Mr Lerriman denied ever having sex with Brittany Higgins. He said they shared an Uber to Parliament, as Brittany also indicated she had to attend Parliament for something. "I thought I was being a gentleman." Mr Lerriman said once inside the ministerial suite, he turned left and Ms Higgins turned right. "I went to my desk, I attended to some question time folders." He said he didn't call out as he left. "I didn't see her again." Mr Lerriman told police he only found out about the rape allegation from a journalist last year, and he had suicidal thoughts. "I wound up everything, I was ready to go. My single mum was going to be okay, she was going to get my superannuation." The court heard from more than 20 witnesses this week, including the security guard who found Ms Higgins allegedly naked in the then Defence Industry Minister's office. 5 colleagues and 2 police officers testified. Brittany Higgins informed them of the alleged assault in the 2 weeks after it was alleged to have happened. The prosecution's case will wrap early next week. Lucy Murray, SBS World News.
And if allegations set out in this story raise issues for you or someone you know needs support, you can seek 24-hour help through 1-800-RESPECT. That's 1-800-737-732. Optus has informed the Australian Passport Office that more than 100,000 passport numbers were compromised as a result of last month's cyber attack. The government says it has taken rapid action to protect victims from identity fraud following the data breach. The Australian Federal Police is yet to track down the person responsible for the attack, but the government says even if people had their passport number compromised, they don't need to replace their passport. A statement posted on the DFAT website says those passports are still safe to use for international travel, and passport numbers cannot be used to obtain a new passport because there are other robust controls. Australian Federal Police are tonight working to protect the details of some of its agents and operations after a series of classified documents were hacked from the Colombian government. The data link may have exposed the identities of agents working to uncover drug cartels operating in Australia. The AFP says it's concerned about possible breaches of operation security. The government says it is serious.
Because you've got Colombian drug cartels that stretch across the world that are importing drugs around the world, and so you've got organisations like the AFP or the FBI and other police organisations around the world that are all interconnected to this, that when you have a leak like this, it has a massive impact.
An AFP spokesman said cooperation with Colombian law enforcement agencies had prevented large amounts of drug importations entering Australia and had disrupted drug cartels. At least one person has been arrested in Beijing in a rare protest against China's President Xi Jinping. A banner was unfurled on Sitong Bridge in the city's affluent Haidian district. Demands on the banner included the removal of Xi Jinping, who it described as traitorous, and an end to strict COVID-19 policies. Smoke was also set off at the protest. The incident comes in the run-up to the 20th Congress of the ruling Communist Party, where Xi is expected to secure a third leadership term. Iran has again blamed the United States for widespread protests across the country, describing them as a plot from enemies abroad. Demonstrations are rolling into their second month following the death of a young woman in custody over headscarf laws. A top judge has told colleagues to avoid being lenient to protesters who appear in court.
Terrified, the protesters flee. The gunshots coming from security forces on their trail. Similar scenes near Tehran as people run from armed plainclothes security officers. In downtown Tehran, live rounds are fired in the air to move a group of women near a shopping centre.
The Iranian security forces have been firing live ammunition simply to disperse crowds and to crush the protests. The deadly crackdown has so far left over 144 victims that we have identified by name. Among them are at least 24 children.
Those children as young as 11 years old. Amnesty says some were fatally beaten, most were shot to death.
The Iranian authorities have waged an all-out assault on children who have courageously taken to the streets.
This is now the 28th consecutive day of protests, and there's no sign of surrender. A nationwide rally has been planned by youth groups for Saturday.
I think these kinds of dissident voices are going to become louder and they're going to become more significant.
But patience among the regime is wearing thin. Judges have been ordered to issue harsh sentences for the protest instigators and avoid showing them unnecessary sympathy in court. Iran's president among some allies telling them the United States is trying to bring the regime down with the protests.
After America failed militarily with sanctions, Washington and its allies have resorted to the failed policy of destabilisation.
Iran's enemies could benefit from the success of the women in this uprising. But their victory could also have its downsides for some Arab nations.
Every Muslim girl around the world is watching in awe. And that's a virus that the Iranians are putting in the system, and that really worries all of Iran's neighbors.
But this is for now contained in Iran. And the people calling for regime change are raising their voice. Rashida Yousafzai, SBS World News.
Defying threats of more violence, Kurdish politician Abdul Latif Rashid has been elected as Iraq's new president. The move, made after a barrage of rocket attacks earlier in the day, paves the way for the formation of a new power-sharing government. The 78-year-old is a British-educated engineer who has previously served as Iraq's Water Resources Minister. Political wrangling and repeated crises prevented the appointment of a new government after federal elections were held in October 2021. Global markets have rebounded despite inflation in the US remaining hot. Virginia Langerberg joins me now with more. Virginia, it all but confirms another supersized interest rate rise in the US.
That is right, Ricardo. Another 75 basis point increase is what most of the market is tipping, and that's because inflation in the US rose by 0.4% in September to be at 8.2% higher on the year. But as you can see, there are suggestions that inflation may have peaked. One concern, though, is that when you take away two of the biggest contributors to rising prices, that's food and energy, that annual inflation number is still climbing. That suggests the lift in prices is broad-based, meaning across the economy. Still, investors chose to focus on the headline rate, which eased slightly from the previous month, with markets surging. The Dow Jones index up 2.8%.
There's been a lot of fear in the US and the UK that inflation is out of control. But what we've seen in the past couple of months, and particularly last night, is things coming in line with expectations. They're not becoming worse. They're not necessarily better, but they're not getting worse. And that's enough at the moment to give the market some breathing room and to provide some optimism, which we haven't had so far.
And that sense of optimism spread through to our share market after 3 days of lacklustre moves. The ASX 200 added 1.8%. Energy stocks did best as oil prices rose overnight. Iron ore players climbed as inflation in China rose by less than expected, 2.8% over the year. Qantas continued to take off following yesterday's profit update. Supermarket operators also rose. The Australian dollar is up against the greenback, yen and euro, but down against the British pound and the New Zealand dollar. Super funds have faced challenging market conditions in September, with the median balanced growth fund falling by 3.1%. Analysts at Super Ratings say global growth concerns hit investor sentiment, extending the losses on super funds to 5.7% over the last 12 months. But taking a long-term view, returns are up more than 6% over a 7-year period. Consumer and advocacy groups are calling on the Senate to pass changes to payday loans to protect vulnerable people from spiralling deep into debt. The lenders offer consumers fast cash but typically charge high fees and interest. Proposed legislation, which has already passed the lower house, includes a 10% cap on the amount of a person's income that can be taken up in loan repayments.
When vulnerable people are desperate because they need to replace the tyres on the car, then the washing machine breaks down. All of a sudden, it doesn't take much to push an Australian, perhaps who's doing it tough on the margins, right over the edge.
As the government's consultation period on a national electric vehicle strategy wraps up at the end of this month, new figures show demand for electric vehicles has gone up 65% compared to last year. Across Australia, EV sales account for 3.39% of all cars sold, the ACT leading the way, making up 9.5% of all new vehicle sales, with a slower uptake across the country. But according to the Electric Vehicle Council, Australia has a long way to go. Sales in Germany account for 26% of vehicle sales, 19% in the UK and 13% in California.
And the key difference between the UK, for example, and Australia is that they have a fuel efficiency standard. Australia has failed for many years to introduce a fuel efficiency standard. And what that means is there's not a lot of pressure on manufacturers to introduce more fuel-efficient and particularly electric vehicles into our market.
Sales of luxury vehicles have also rocketed, with a record high of more than 12,500 sold for the month of September, with Tesla leading the way. And Ricardo, that is the week in finance.
Thanks, Virginia. Coming up, is there still time to reverse the devastating decline in the world's wildlife population? And 4 years after the ball tampering scandal, Australian batsman David Warner moves closer to a return to captaincy. A new report from the World Wildlife Fund says animal populations around the world have severely declined over the past 50 years. Latin America and the Caribbean, some of the most biodiverse regions in the world, have experienced one of the steepest drops in wildlife. In Colombia's Chingaza National Park, experts are aiming to change that trend. They are working to restore damaged environments before they reach a point of no return.
These are dark times for wildlife around the world. The WWF latest Living Planet report says wild animal populations are in sharp decline, and that nowhere is the loss more concerning than in Latin America and the Caribbean, where monitored populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish have declined by 94% since 1970. This in one of the most biodiverse regions of the world.
The ecosystems in the region are changing very rapidly, and unless we do something quickly, we can face a catastrophe.
Humans are mostly to blame. Since 1970, the region has seen dramatic habitat loss due mainly to agricultural expansion. Deforestation in the Amazon to make space for cattle ranching is threatening the entire world's climate.
Even here, high in the Andean mountains, the expansion of the agricultural frontier has greatly impacted the environment. Potato and onion fields dot the landscape well over 3,000 meters of elevation, endangering animals like the spectacled bear.
But there are silver linings.
This is the Puya gaudiana, colloquially known as cardon. It's the Andean bear's main source of food.
Restoration efforts like this one in Colombia's Chingaza Park aim to replace damaged environments.
The park has prioritized areas that before becoming protected were heavily altered by agriculture and cattle and that haven't been able to recover alone. We're slowly recovering them now with native plants.
Similar programs elsewhere have proven successful, helping restore once threatened species like gorillas in Africa and Brazil's dollar turtle.
It is important to understand that even though the figures are so dramatic and the stakes are so high, we believe that we still have time to make these changes.
World leaders are due to meet at the 15th Convention of Biological Diversity this December. A once-in-a-decade opportunity, experts say, to implement those changes before it's too late.
Alessandro Rampietti reports from Chingaza National Park in Colombia. Hundreds of community members have come together to celebrate the lead-up to Diwali or Deepavali in Western Sydney. Also known as the Festival of Light, Diwali marks the triumph of good over evil and light over darkness. Across Australia, more than 1 million Hindus, Jains, Buddhists and Sikhs celebrate versions of the event, which is bringing community members together in Parramatta this weekend.
Everyone is going to enjoy lots of Bollywood cultural and musical performances along with beautiful Indian food. So it's a perfect time for our community to come together. It's a perfect night for harmony, friendship, unity in diversity.
Diwali is a triumph over evil. So who doesn't want to triumph over evil? That's a common ground for all of us to celebrate together with all the communities in Australia and bring that depth of unity in diversity.
Diwali will take place on October 24, with celebrations usually lasting 5 days. Australian cricketer David Warner could return to team leadership roles 4 years after the ball tampering scandal that saw him given a lifetime ban from captaincy positions. At a board meeting today, Cricket Australia moved to amend its code of conduct. It opens a door for Warner to appeal his leadership ban. The 35-year-old has been linked to the captaincy of both the Australian one-day side and the Sydney Thunder. In the Women's Big Bash this afternoon, the Hobart Hurricanes have comfortably won their opening match, beating the Sydney Thunder by 19 runs. Rachel Treneman and Mion Dupriere top scored for the Hurricanes with 31 and 33 respectively, while Molly Strano and Heather Graham took 3 wickets each in the Thunder's innings. Meanwhile, in last night's opening match of the tournament, the Sydney Sixers won a thriller against the Brisbane Heart in Mackay. Elise Perry took 2 wickets and then made 55 as the Sixers won with just 1 ball to spare. Maitland Brown hitting a 6 from the first ball she faced to win the match. Coming up, the weather, and First Nations designers make their mark at Melbourne Fashion Week. The weather forecast: troughs will generate showers and storms over northeast Western Australia, Western Northern Territory and central Queensland. A trough over Tasmania will trigger showers. High pressure will keep Western Australia, South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria generally dry and settled. Major centres: a shower or 2 in Darwin, partly cloudy in Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne. Afternoon showers in Hobart, partly cloudy in Adelaide, sunny in Perth. Looking further afield, fine in Nandi, showers in Tahiti, partly cloudy in Apia, Noumea and Wellington. In Southeast Asia, thunder in Bangkok, clouds for Phnom Penh, thunder in Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, drizzle in Jakarta. Further north, fine in Beijing along with Seoul, clouds for Tokyo, drizzle in Taipei, fine in Hong Kong, clouds in Hanoi. Heading west, fine in Beirut, partly cloudy in Jerusalem, fine in Tehran, partly cloudy in Islamabad, fine in New Delhi. Across to Europe, where there'll be rain in Stockholm, fine in Moscow, showers in Dublin, drizzle in Berlin, rain in London, showers in Warsaw, partly cloudy in Kiev. In Africa, partly cloudy in Algiers, fine in Cairo, partly cloudy in Dakar, thunder in Lagos, partly cloudy in Addis Ababa, fine in Johannesburg. In South America, thunder in Caracas and Panama City, rain in Bogota and La Paz, drizzle in Asunción. And for North America, fine in Vancouver, showers for Toronto, fine in Chicago, thunder in Miami and a few showers in Havana. Indigenous artists have been front and centre at Melbourne Fashion Week. From flowing fabrics on solo runway shows to art and design pop-ups, First Nations fashion is being celebrated like never before.
Culture interwoven with wearable art. Moving garments showcase Indigenous Australia, and it takes a village to make it all happen.
Collaboration, connectedness, togetherness, it sits at the heart of what we do.
Clothes more than just something to wear. They're materials with meaning.
It's a really beautiful way to share First Nations stories. For me, it was really about being able to, use fashion as a vehicle to be able to celebrate our culture, share more of our stories, not just nationally, but into the future internationally.
It's a special occasion, not only for the established, but also the emerging.
This will be my first fashion week in which I'll be having my collection go down the runway.
From dramatic runways to free pop-ups that roam the city's streets, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander creatives are moving into the style scene's spotlight, a formerly exclusive industry heading in the right direction.
So it's really good to see Australia waking up and actually embracing us, especially in this medium, should I say, instead of just Indigenous art hanging on walls. It's coming to life on our mob and the non-Indigenous community as well.
Representation matters, not just for one generation, but for all.
It's everywhere and it's really important, and I love watching our next generation being able to see that and be able to, see themselves represented.
First Nations representation at Melbourne Fashion Week is the highest it's ever been, and this weekend, the Garnboom Mara runway puts mob front and centre.
I'm just really, really excited for this runway. It's going to be absolutely beautiful.
Monique Pueblos, SBS World News.
That is The World this Friday. If you missed some of tonight's bulletin, you can catch up on SBS On Demand shortly. And for the latest news, head to the SBS News website. Virginia will be back with our next bulletin at 10:15 after tonight's episode of The World's Greatest Hotels. From the team, I'm Ricardo Gonçalves. Good night.